Thank you, Holly, and good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. We will go ahead and jump right into our presentation that we have scheduled for you today on CAEP CFAD and annual planning. As Holly went through, my name is Myra Diaz, and I'm joined by my colleagues today, Neil and Mandali. Next slide, please. So what we will be talking about today is going over the state budget update, conducting a CFAD overview, an allocation amendment, going through that process if that is needed this year, walking you through the annual plan and the budget and work plan overview. We will also then open it up for questions and discussions towards the end of the presentation. However, we will also be monitoring the chat and trying to address those as questions come up. But just know that we'll also have an opportunity to address any questions at the end. We will also have Mandali assist us with conducting a live walkthrough in Nova as we go through some of these upcoming CAEP deliverables. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to start by going over the state budget update. For 24-25 in January, when the governor released his governor's budget proposal for 24-25, it was captured that approximately $651 million in allocations would be made available to the CAEP regional consortia, proposing about a 0.76 COLA increase, and that totals about $4.9 million in funding. The CAEP office released the 24-25 preliminary allocations back in February, just a couple of weeks ago. However, the legislature is continuing to monitor the state budget deficit, as we are all hearing about in the news, in all of our news outlets, that California is facing a large budget deficit. Therefore, we could anticipate some potential fiscal impacts to our CAEP allocations, and we are closely monitoring for these impacts. The Legislative Analyst Office is proposing the COLA pullback, and so therefore some of the key dates that we will be monitoring, but also encourage you to monitor, is the state revenue updates that will be released or made available in April, along with the May revise that is typically made available around mid-May. And finally, once the final June trailer bill is passed, we will get a full sense of the 24-25 final allocations that will be made available, and whether or not that includes, if it retains or eliminates, the proposed COLA for this program. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we have released the CAEP preliminary allocations, the next step in the process is completing the Consortium Fiscal Administrative Declaration, otherwise known as the CFAD. It is available annually, and it typically becomes available as soon as we release the consortium's preliminary allocations that are entered in NOVA. As I mentioned, it is due annually every May 2nd, and that is coming around the corner. When completing this deliverable, all of the members must certify the consortium CFAD. It is important to note that the members should not receive less than the prior year's allocation, which is outlined in Education Code. Once this CFAD is certified by the consortium, then the annual plan will become available in NOVA, and we will be walking through the NOVA sequence of deliverables to get a sense of how these tie to one another and how they become available and accessible for the field to complete as each of these get completed. Next slide, please. We want to take a pause and highlight, this was something that we mentioned earlier this year when we had the AB 1491 carryover compliance CFAD updates, the CFAD NOVA enhancements. As you are currently working on completing your CFAD, keep in mind that this will be an item that will populate, and it is a discussion that you're going to want to have as a consortium to decide if you are going to opt in or opt out of incorporating a carryover threshold. This is the carryover threshold is something that you'll revisit annually as it is a part of the CFAD. And so essentially, what you'll be able to do is if you opt in, as it is tied to AB 1491 carryover compliance and monitoring the carryover for the members, if you decide to opt in by establishing this carryover compliance threshold, you will simply toggle over to the on section. And so what that will do is then it will require you or ask you to input what the consortium carryover threshold will be, what you would like to use. Please note that you get to revisit this on an annual basis, which means some of you may have opted in last year and have identified a threshold. You can keep that, you can revise that, you can opt out. You have the opportunity to decide what direction the consortium is going to apply this for fiscal year 24-25. If you choose to not opt in, then you would simply identify and select that. It will not require you to enter the carryover threshold, and you're not going to see the corrective action fiscal reporting quarterly threshold. Now, if you select to partake as a consortia to track and monitor what the carryover threshold will be, alerting if your members have exceeded that excessive carryover, then the next steps will be to include the carryover threshold percentage. You will also see the corrective action fiscal reporting quarterly threshold. For this current fiscal year that we are in, 23-24, those were preset in NOVA. So you may not recall completing this step last year. However, this year, members or the consortia will be required to identify the carryover threshold percentages for each quarter that you would like to use. You can use the standard ones, you can be more aggressive and select something different. But essentially, keep in mind that those carryover action fiscal reporting quarterly thresholds will trigger when you are completing the quarterly fiscal reporting, the expenditure reporting. This is what will trigger the corrective action plan for the members. So if the member has excessive carryover, these percentages is what is essentially populating that throughout the year. So just keep that in mind. And should, as mentioned in that last bullet, should a member's carryover exceed the corrective action plan threshold, then they will be asked to provide an explanation of the reasons during quarterly expenditure reporting. So that is the narrative box that you'll see in the fiscal reporting section if the member is flagged for having excessive carryover based upon these percentages for that quarter. Next slide, please. Also, this was something that we covered in last year's fiscal year, or this current year, fiscal year 23-24 CFAD updates. As you are completing the CFAD, question number 16 and number 17 specifically are tied to this AB 1491 carryover compliance. So it'll be important to also have this conversation as you're completing the CFAD to address how the consortium is going to monitor, is going to work with the carryover and monitoring the excessive carryover. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Mandalee.
All right, everyone. So I'm going to open up the sandbox in Nova, which is the ability to train people in a safe environment. So I'm going to do a quick stop share, and I'm going to reshare my screen. So just bear with me. Everyone should now be seeing my screen, I think. Okay, if we're not, someone yell at me. So once you log into Nova, you're going to go ahead and go to CAEP. You'll go to consortia and members, and then you're going to find your consortia. So for today, we're going to go ahead and use Antelope. We always pick on Allen Hancock because they're number one. So we'll go ahead and use Antelope. Once you're in your consortium file, you're going to scroll down to the Consortium Fiscal Administration Declaration. So your CFAD. It's going to be in draft status, as you can see here, for the 24-25 year. The name of the consortia fiscal admin declaration is right here, which is the link that will open up your CFAD. Like Myra had just shared, you're going to see your workflow. You are going to walk through each one of these steps before you hit preview. So here you want to just confirm that you are going to either remain either a fiscal agent or a direct funded. If there are no changes, then you'll be able just to hit next. So right here it says your current distribution method is direct funded. Do you plan to stay this way? So you do have to say yes or no. We're going to go ahead and hit yes. Oh, did I do that wrong? Do you plan to continue this selection for 24-25? Yes. And then it'll provide, and believe this is new, it's going to open up a narrative where you will explain how you are going to move forward. So I'm just going to kind of put in some letters here. We're going to go ahead and provide the narrative to those questions and then move on to the next box. The last box here, and I do want to highlight the changes that if there are any changes, this is where you would include your fiscal structure, change in a fiscal agent, or your funding amounts. Okay. And then you'll hit next. And then here is where you're going to review your member agencies and the correct certifiers. As long as all of this looks appropriate and correct, you will want to make sure that all of your member representatives are right and correct. And this is a great opportunity just to pause and remind everybody, we update our listserv based on the information that we have here in Nova. So if there is something incorrect here and you do update that, that is also how we get updated here when we send out direct messages. You'll click the next button here if everything looks correct to you. And then you're going to review your member allocations. And this is where your allocation dollar amount will be here. And if this looks correct to you for your CFAD, if there are no changes, and there shouldn't be any, you're going to go ahead and hit next. And this is the carryover compliance piece. So carryover compliance does apply to the consortium, that 20%. This is the area that Myra had just covered with you. If you choose to toggle it on for each member carryover threshold. So if you want it off, and this is your opportunity to see if that worked, if last year you did it and you want to maybe change it or vice versa, or you want to continue to do this, you would add in the percentages here for the Q1, 2, and 3, not to exceed the 20%, which is listed right here. Or if you choose to turn that off and that you have your own strategies or processes to monitor your member carryover, that is something that your consortia will have to decide to do. Any questions? Nothing so far. If this is something that once you're bored and everyone has moved forward with understanding what that member carryover threshold is, you'll go ahead and go to the next section, which is the governance section. This will have those, I think it's 20 questions, 16 and 17 being those newer questions that speak directly to the carryover compliance and what those percentage thresholds are. And this is where you would provide that narrative explaining what that looks like and how each consortia and member will use those unspent funds or transfer them. When you hit preview, you will go into this preview portion here, making sure that everything you entered is correct. There aren't any changes. If there are changes, you can just select it by going to the different areas within the workflow to update it, and then back to your preview section. If everything looks correct to you here, this is where you're going to submit. One area to note is the CFAD, once you submit it, your members will then approve it. If there is a change, if someone does, once it's done, you can't go back and edit. It's not something that you can amend. Once your CFAD is certified, it is a locked document and you cannot go back and edit. The only opportunity would be if one of your members were to reject your CFAD, and then it would take you back to a draft status where any edits could be made. If you go into a draft status at that point, when somebody does reject it, you will have to make at least a minimum of a $1 change to the allocation for that then to go through. Otherwise, I would just say really take your time and go through the preview portion before you submit it. Make sure it is up to everybody's expectations, that this is something that there are no questions on, because again, the next opportunity to look at your CFAT again and to make any changes will be the next year in 2026. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop share. I'm going to reshare and go back to our PowerPoint. And I'll hand it off to, I can hand it back off to you, Myra.
Thank you, Mandalee. All right, so now that we've gone over the CFAD, we're going to talk about the allocation amendment and provide you with an overview and then transition back over to another live demo walkthrough. As we mentioned in earlier slides, based on our current budget deficit and what we see get finalized by June or July, if and when there is a change to the January CAEP preliminary allocations, once the final state budget is released, then the state will be required to revise the initial preliminary CAEP allocations that are currently reflected in NOVA. And this is if the proposed COLA, which is captured in the January preliminary allocations that are published in the memo that we had sent out and also outlined or captured in NOVA. If the COLA is not approved, then there will be a change, a revision that will be required by the state. And so we will go in and conduct an allocation amendment in NOVA for each of the CAEP regional consortium so that we can capture the correct allocation based on the final state budget. The CAEP State Office will release, as usual, an annual final CAEP allocations memo and schedule that we typically make available towards the beginning of July once the budget is finalized. And that will capture the final CAEP allocations. This updated CAEP allocation schedule that we will release in July will include the detailed amounts that is broken out by the direct funded member and the fiscal agents. And also, it is important to know that because of education code, it's important to note that their consortia or members should not be receiving less than what they obtained in the prior year or the same percent split. So keep an eye as we are monitoring the budget throughout the coming months, and we will release the final allocations memo and schedule that will capture what those totals are. However, if there is a change to the proposed COLA, if there is a cut, then an allocation amendment will be necessary, and we will go over what that process will entail in the coming slides. Next slide, please. So I did want to provide you with an overview of the NOVA sequence of these CAEP deliverable submissions and how they tie to one another. If you try and go in right now and access your annual plan, the consortium annual plan, you'll notice that you won't be able to access that. And so typically, we want to be able to break down what this sequence of events will look like for you to keep in mind as you're working on these concurring deliverables that will be coming up against one another. So if an allocation amendment is deemed necessary based on the final state budget revisions, then the CAEP Regional Consortia will need to certify the allocation amendment and post the new allocation amounts in NOVA by August 30th. So this will be something that the consortium will need to do if there is an allocation amendment. As you're currently working on the CFAD, which is due May 2nd, and once that is submitted and certified, then the annual plan will become available and you'll be able to access to begin to complete this deliverable in NOVA. Please note that the ability to access the annual plan will not be impacted by any required pending allocation amendments that may be outstanding in NOVA. So the CFAD is required to be submitted and certified in order for the annual plan to become available. However, an allocation amendment is not going to impact being able to complete the annual plan. You'll still be able to access the annual plan while you are still working on the allocation amendment piece. Now with the member budget and work plan, this will be accessible once the annual plan is certified. And the deadline is going to be in August for the annual plan, and we'll cover that in the coming slides, some of these upcoming deadlines. But just know that in order to access the member budget and work plan, the annual plan will have to be submitted and certified. There is a limitation. The member budget and work plan for any of the members that are affected by the pending allocation amendment will not be able to access the plan until the allocation amendment is completed. So the member budget and work plan will be affected if the allocation amendment is not completed and certified. Once the allocation amendment is certified, those that are impacted by this movement of funds will need to adjust their budgets. However, NOVA will automatically place in draft status. It will automatically place you there if you're not already there. And we'll walk through what that's going to look like. So I'm going to hand it over to Mandalee.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop share again just so I can flip between my desktops. So if you guys will just bear with me, we'll do this one more time. And we'll go ahead and pop back into Nova. And as Myra stated, some of these items we're not really going to be able to fully open up and walk through, but I do want to also direct you, we'll walk through the allocation amendment, and as we continue on, we do have some past webinars for some of our newer people, if it's helpful to kind of walk through the process, and then we'll always are available here to do that with you as well. So here we are in Nova. I did see that we can pick on Alan Hancock, so we're going to go ahead and do that for the allocation amendment this time. When you go into your consortium, you're going to go down to allocations. I'm sorry for the quick scroll, and we'll go ahead and well, looks like we were already playing in here earlier. So you'll usually see what it'll look like this. It'll be start amendment, and if you start an amendment and you don't finish it, then you'll have this continue amendment. You want to make sure that you're in the right year. We're going to go ahead and hit continue. Just as before, you're always going to want to make sure that you confirm that your member agencies and certifiers are listed and are correct. Then you'll go ahead and hit next. Okay. So Nova's been a little silly with me lately. It might not, oh, here we go. I just have to keep pushing. All right, so once you go to the member allocation, what's new to Nova is it's gonna allow you to select the reason for the allocation. So you'll have either the May revise, which is likely what we'll be doing, a standard member transfer, or if there's a new member that you're starting to fund. So we're gonna go ahead and hit May revise, provide the explanation here. And this is a great opportunity to provide details, just like we've always mentioned in the past. You always want to provide those notes for journaling. This allows you to provide those notes within Nova. So if ever needed to go back and walk through why a decision was made, why monies were transferred, all of those details can be listed here. So just because these are big numbers, I'm just going to go ahead and we're going to make a proposed allocation and we're going to take away. So I'm going to go to 24 here. You'll see the adjustment of $10 here, which means that we'll have to do the increase to our other member. So we're going to increase that here to 1,181,239. And then with the adjustment of a reduction and then an addition, we should still have $0 remaining. What you don't want to see is any money left over. So if we were to incorrectly adjust that, you're going to see that that dollar amount is going to be here in red. We don't want to do that. And you always want to make sure that that's a $0 amount. Once you have provided the allocation, you have the proposed allocation here. You can always go back into this column, which is going to remind you of what the current allocation is, what the changes are, and then those adjusted dollar amounts. If that all looks good to you, then you will hit next. And then you're going to scroll through, and this is that preview letting you know why you're doing this. This is the May revise, the narrative for the justification. And then you'll hit submit. Okay. What step did I miss? So I think that error message that I was getting earlier is not allowing me to move forward because I do believe all steps were completed. So once you submit your allocation, it will then go to your members for them to approve. And then once it's approved, you'll the allocation, once that's done in Nova, as a reminder, will still need to be done physically. So if you make an allocation in Nova, this is essentially where you're journaling it, but a warrant would still need to be, or a transfer of funds will still need to happen. So with that, I'm going to ask if there's any questions regarding an allocation amendment. Looks like that was just Neil responding. Thank you. I'll go ahead and stop share and we'll go back to the PowerPoint. Okay.
All right, thanks, Mandalee. I'm going to take you through the annual plan process and then also the budget and work plan. And then Mandalee will do another demo in Nova like she just did. So the annual plan process in Ed Code 84906 talks about a 3-year plan, and it also includes an annual update, which we call the annual plan. So if you're wondering where the annual plan came from, it comes from Ed Code, and it's related to our planning cycle, which we'll show in a subsequent slide how everything interconnects. Next slide, please. So here is that components and the connectivity. So you have the 3-year plan, which is done every 3 years. And then we have the CFAD, which Myra went over, which we do annually. And then, of course, the annual plan, which ties into the 3-year plan. That's done every year. And then as a result of the annual plan, we do the member budget and work plan, which is then submitted after that. And you can see how that cascades. And I think we have another slide that shows kind of a graphic of that cascade. Next slide, please. So here's when Mandalee goes through Nova, you'll see the breakdown of the annual plan, very similar to the 3-year plan. Section 1 is plans and goals. There's an executive summary, an overview, and regional needs identified. And then the next section gets into the addressing the educational needs, and that's where you have the metrics, activities, and things like that. And then the following section is, this is kind of related to the AB 86 days when we talked about integration of services and transitions. So that still is prevalent in the 3-year plan and getting into CAEP. And so you can see that historical effort there from the get-go of our program 10 years ago. Next slide, please. And then, of course, section 4, improve effectiveness of services, more strategies and metrics. And then last section 5 is your fiscal management, similar to what you would put in the CFAD, but a little more detail on carryover funds and the impact to your strategies. And then, of course, section 6 is where you do preview and submit and certification by all your members. Next slide, please. So here's the alignment. You know, of course, the annual plan is a subset of the 3-year plan. It's listed in Ed Code, which we talked about. Your annual plan updates your strategies and metrics. You don't have to have new ones. You can just be updating the ones you presented in the 3-year plan, because that covers 3 years. And the annual plan is an update of that year that you're going into. Certified by all members, as we said. And of course, Nova ties the annual plan to the 3-year plan. Next slide, please. Okay, here are some dates. So of course, as you know, August 15th is the annual plan submission. Then we have September 30th, which is the member work plan and budget submission. And then October 30th is when the consortium certifies the member work plan and budget. And then as a result of all that, you have your first quarter expenditure reports due September 1st. One thing I want to note is also on September 30th, you have your Q4 submission of your expenditures from 23-24. And that's critical because until you do your Q4, you can't really move forward on your work plan and budget because we have to finalize the last year's figures to see how much you're carrying in to the next year. And that will reflect in your work plan and budget. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Next slide, please. Okay, next few slides are just tips. And then after that, I think there's a budget and work plan, and then we'll turn it over to Mandalee to walk us through it. So of course, as I said earlier, annual plan is a mixture of new and existing strategies. Annual plan is similar to the prior year. If it is, do your best to describe what's different from the last year to this year. Maybe you've completed some of those steps. Maybe you haven't started, so you could provide descriptions or explanations, and then also an update of how responsive it is to current events described in your plan. Next slide, please. And then here's that graphic of showing the 3-year plan as an overarching vision and goals. And then you have the annual plan, which is an annual update with strategies that help the consortium achieve those goals. And then you have the member budget and expenses that get into more granular detail at the local level. So it's hierarchical. Annual plans can be amended throughout the year. So if things change, you can always update that in Nova. Next slide, please. And then here's some kind of just when you're trying to get members to certify, you can always send a reminder. That's a feature in Nova. You just click on a button and it automatically sends a reminder to your member representatives to approve it if they haven't. Also, I think we described this earlier, consortium work plans and budgets will open after the annual plan has been approved. Also, strategies are selected in the annual plan by just checking a box. No need to rewrite strategies or provide additional information if they're already in there. Next slide, please. And then, of course, annual plan strategies will drive your member work plans. Those must be certified October 30th. And when you develop your member work plan and budget, that's for the school year starting July 1, going through June 30th. So it's that 12-month cycle. Next slide, please. And then lastly, just a little reminder on the budget and work plan overview. Budget and work plan will open once the annual plan is certified. Also, the member work plan budget can be worked on but not submitted until you submit your Q4. And I think Myra put something in that regards in the chat. So just note that 24-25 funds can't be calculated until Q4 is certified. And so your budget and work plan is related to 24-25 funds, so you can see how they're connected. The interesting thing is the Q4 is due September 30th, as well as the budget and work plan is due September 30th. So we would advise you to get that Q4 in early so then you can do your budget and work plan. Sometimes that's not possible. We know Q4 is a big deal at some districts. They work till the last minute. Sometimes they go over, but because we're calculating carryover this year with that Q4, it's really important to get it in on that September 30th date. And then, of course, if you have an allocation amendment, failure to certify that amendment will hold up the member budget and work plan. And we found that last year when we did a slight adjustment, like a few $100s for most consortia. There was a percentage adjustment. A lot of consortia forgot to process or approve their allocation amendment. And so that caused all kinds of problems. So just remember, when we do have an allocation amendment, it's due September 30th. But we would encourage you to do it as soon as you can, if possible. That way it doesn't get hung up on all these other things. And then, of course, once the allocation amendment is certified, members will adjust their budget work plan. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mandalee.
Okay, I am going to jump into Nova again. Just do a quick new share screen. Oops. Nope, that's right. All right. So once you log into Nova, again, go to CAEP, find your consortia. We'll go ahead and pop into Alan Hancock. And just like Neil said and Myra said, unfortunately, I won't be able to walk you through what those specific steps will look like for the annual plan. But what we will do is we'll walk through what that would look like. So let me go to a different. It looks like someone was already playing, probably doing some teaching in the sandbox with Alan Hancock. So I'm going to go to, here we'll go to Salinas and we'll pull up their annual plan, and it's going to go through and we'll look at what that those areas were that Neil was talking about. I also want to bring your attention to our website with webinars that will also walk you through these live demonstrations done later in the year when those annual plans and the budget and work plan are open. So if you really want to go through step by step, bear in mind, Nova has had some updates, just like you saw with the allocation. So there may be some slight differences, but it should still be able to walk you through what those workflow steps look like. And you can always reach out to Holly or myself at TAP to support you through that. So when I clicked on the annual plan here for Salinas, just like Neil said, it's going to go over the plans and goals. You'll have this executive summary. Through when it is open, you'll be able to type in that executive summary, select those metrics, those student barriers. And just as a reminder, just like on the slide, I think that Neil had pointed out, you do not have to rewrite those strategies. Your annual plan is the portion of your 3-year plan. So it should pre-populate what those look like. And then to Neil's point, if there are any updates or explanations that need to be expressed, this is when you would do it in the annual plan. So as we go into 24-25, as a reminder, this is the 3rd year of the last 3-year plan iteration. So all of this should be mostly pre-populated. It'll go through your different activities, and then you will select those and continue on. This looks like a very big document, and it is, but I promise you, as you go through those steps in Nova, it does create those nice narrative boxes for you. It also gives you helper text as a reminder of what you're speaking to. And it just really walks you through that process. Then you get the nice little completed sign once each section is done. So you're feeling like you're accomplishing things. And unfortunately, like I said, I can't really show you what those pieces look like here. Most of you have probably already seen it. A lot of you have already done it a few times, I would say. But if there are any questions, always, throw them in the chat. I know that Myra, Neil, and Holly, I see that they've been in the chat quite a bit. You can always reach out to us when that does open up. We'll be able to jump onto a Zoom and walk you through that. And then, like I mentioned, I would also go to our webinars, and you can see the last one, I think that Myra, Neil, and myself did in August, and it takes you through the sequence and all of those steps with some screenshots as well as a recording. So that is the annual plan. And then I'm going to come back over here. Once you submit the annual plan, just like Neil has already stated, that is when your budget and work plan will open up. It essentially unlocks that budget and work plan so you can start to allocate those funds in those different resource codes, identifying how you're going to use those funds for your program. All right, let's go ahead and go here. It's going to go a quick scroll again. Well, not too quick. Don't want to make people sick. at the very, very bottom. And this is where you would find your budget and work plan. So I'm going to, I think I already have it up. Okay, if you go to the CAEP website under administrators and webinars and fiscal data and reporting, the budget and work plan and quarterly expenditure, I think this will walk you through the budget and work plan for anyone that has any questions. And I can drop that link in the chat if that is helpful. And then with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and go back to the slide deck. Is it sharing? Yes, I'm sharing now. Sorry, I have multiple screens and desktops going, so I wasn't sure if I grabbed the right one. Were there any questions on the budget and work plan or the annual in Nova?
There were none posted in the chat.
Okay. Okay, so that is we're now at the wrap up. I'll go pass it back to either Neil or Myra.
Yeah, I just want to add that we have plenty of time. So if anybody wants to put anything in the chat or come off a mic, plenty of time to ask the experts.
So Neil, we did just get a question in the chat. Janae asked if the budget changes after the CFAT is certified and an allocation amendment needs to be submitted. Please clarify these process points. The state will conduct an allocation amendment in Nova for each CAEP regional consortium, which was slide 9, to be certified by consortium members, or each consortia start their own individual allocation amendment after the state sends out the memo stating each consortium's new allocation amount. Also, will that memo break the allocations down per member agency for direct funded consortia or just at the consortium level? Thank you.
Yeah, really good question. So what we will do is and thank you for pulling up that slide, Amanda-Lee, if there is an update to the final budget, if the proposed COLA is eliminated, the state will conduct an allocation amendment in Nova to capture the final allocations. We typically conduct that process in alignment as we're getting ready to release the final memo. So the state will finalize the allocation amendment in Nova, and then we will work to release the final allocations memo and schedule that will include the detailed amounts by member and by or direct funded member and fiscal agents. However, then the next step from there will potentially be where the consortium will need to conduct their allocation amendments for their individual members. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Yeah, I could just add that I think last year when we did this, it was around the first week of July, and we included in that, because of the direct funded members, they don't have a fiscal agent. So we included the adjusted amounts that all you had to do is type that into Nova. And so we already figured it out, because we have a lot of consortia that sometimes try to calculate this stuff by themselves. And so they try to remove 0.76 or whatever the amount is, and they don't go out to the final decimal point, and then it's off. And so the state will calculate that for the direct funded. Now, the fiscal agent, they should be doing something similar. We always recommend using the same percentage. And if they take away the COLA, it would be the same amount as last year. So that's just a rule of thumb.
And just to add to that, so on the website, and I posted a link, you can always find that memo and the allocation and the dollar amount, just like Neil said, how the state will provide that number for you to input.
Thank you. I did receive a direct message from a participant who has a question about changing amounts due to ineffectiveness in the CFAD. I don't know if that member is comfortable coming off mute to ask it. If not, please email me your question and I will ask on your behalf.
I mean, I can just cover that really quick, Holly. So there's only 3 ways. So first of all, the COLA is not something that's negotiable. Everyone gets the COLA. So that 0.76, that is non-negotiable. It goes to everyone. And it should be based on the same percentage that they got last year. So if they got 24% last year of the consortia allocation, they get 24% of the amount this year, which includes the COLA. So the COLA is non-negotiable. Everybody gets it. If you did want to reduce a member's funding, you have only 3 reasons that you could use, criteria. It's if the member can't do the plan, doesn't want to do the adult ed plan, or is deemed ineffective. And we have listed ineffectiveness as the carryover, and then the other way of a ineffective member would be defined by the consortium. So other than that, it's really up to the consortia because you opt in or out on the consortia carryover. So that could be one way, or you come up with an agreed upon ineffective criteria for your consortium. I don't know, Myra, if you had anything else you wanted to add on that one.
Yeah, no, I know this could be, there's a lot of steps involved, and hopefully this presentation overview of these deliverables as you're currently working on the CFAD and then the annual plan. As we mentioned earlier, we did conduct a webinar on these NOVA enhancements if you want to dive into some of that content earlier in January, and that information, the webinar, the PowerPoint overview for that is also posted on the CAEP TAP website. There were some really good resources if you're going to be, as you're addressing this AB 1491 carryover compliance, now that the CFAD is available, and you're looking at establishing a carryover threshold. That is a really good resource to refer back to, and you'll have the opportunity, as Neil had went over, to opt in or opt out. But we have, one thing that we want to flag is just making sure that you are having these conversations within your consortium to look at the member level carryover and the consortium level carryover. Because of the current budget deficit, we certainly don't want to be that program that has all this excessive carryover. As the state offices are looking at finding ways to balance the budget deficit. And so it's important to look at the current carryover balances and how you want to use the NOVA tools to help you capture and flag what that's going to look like. We mentioned earlier that September 30th is going to be the first full year of tracking that will be captured in NOVA, and that will go for the member level carryover. If you've opted in, you'll see some flags. And then also the consortium carryover, that is automatically going to be monitored, and the NOVA system is set up to capture and flag. And that webinar that we mentioned breaks down what those tools, what the flags will include as we get to September 30th. So right now is the opportunity to have those conversations as you're currently working on the CFAD. And as we went over how those questions are included in the governance questionnaire, but also where you're going to select your percentage threshold, and then how you want that to trigger when the expenditure fiscal reports are being completed.
Okay, thank you. And then just a follow-up question from that member asked, so a reduction in funds for an ineffective member can be done, but it must be done before the CFAD approval?
I believe, yeah, if you're going to do an allocation, well, actually an allocation amendment can happen at any time during the year. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done at the CFAD. And it just depends on if you want to reduce the member's base, or if it's just an allocation amendment during the year. That would be a good conversation to have within the consortium.
Okay, thank you. And then Kelly asked, Kelly has a question about opt-in and opt-out. Kelly, are you?
I think, hi, everybody. I think, so if we chose not to opt out last year, and this year we're trying to decide if we should opt in or not, let's just say that we don't opt in this year for member agencies. Technically, the whole consortium is opted in, and we will have to follow AB 1491 anyways, starting next year, correct?
So essentially, AB 1491 carryover compliance, there's, as we've mentioned, there's two levels of tracking. One is at the consortium level, and legislation outlines the 20% carryover threshold. So NOVA is automatically going to be capturing at the consortium level whether the consortium is exceeding that 20% carryover threshold. Now, when it comes to the member level, if you opt in and enter a carryover threshold, then NOVA will assist in monitoring and flagging if that member has exceeded whatever threshold you've identified. If you opt out, NOVA will not be capturing and flagging that, but you want to ensure that as a consortium, the members in the consortium are working to address and monitor that carryover, because it can still affect the consortium level carryover if it exceeds that 20% carryover. And therefore, what will take place after September 30th, once we run our snapshot of the first year, if the consortium has exceeded the 20% carryover threshold, NOVA will flag. The consortium will be required to complete a written expenditure plan and be assigned technical assistance by the state. So the state will be monitoring and tracking if the consortium has exceeded that carryover. The member or within the consortium, you're not required to select or opt in or opt out. However, you do want to ensure that you are working to keep that carryover, those carryover balances that the members are carrying below that 20%, because the consortium will then be flagged. And I know it can be a little tricky. I hope I explained that. Kelly, do you have any additional questions?
No, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I think that that may have addressed Elle's question, or at least a portion of it. So the next question in the chat was posted by Elle, and it was regarding the carryover button. She said, I think it was in the CFAD. If you toggle it on and it shows each quarter, quarter one and quarter two will be flagged because you have way more than 20% left at that time. But if you shut it off, does that mean you are not doing the 20% carryover for the whole year?
So if you toggle it off, it essentially means that your members will not be flagged. The consortium will not be able to monitor individually. I mean, you can essentially, but NOVA will not be monitoring and flagging it for you. So NOVA is still going to be tracking and capturing and monitoring if the consortium as a whole is exceeding that 20% carryover. So the two-part rule. So the first one, obviously, we keep talking about the consortium, 20% carryover. Whether you opt in or if you opt out, it does not matter, because we are still tracking at a state level whether the consortium is going to have that 20% carryover threshold or not. If they do, then what will be prompted is a written expenditure plan for the consortium to complete. And then at the member level, the consortium has the opportunity to use NOVA and the tools we've embedded to help the consortium and their members in monitoring and tracking that carryover. As we mentioned in one of the earlier slides about the CFAD, where you opt in, you'll input the carryover percentage, and then it'll also ask you for the quarterly threshold percentages. And that is more of a helpful tool that will then populate when the expenditure reports are being completed. And that populates, it will prompt the corrective action plan for the member as a warning sign, letting them know about their carryover. So these are all helpful tools embedded in NOVA to help the members monitor and track and be aware of their carryover, but also for the consortium to work with their members to monitor that level of tracking.
Perfect. Thank you. And then I know another question came through. So I think I answered Janae in the chat, so we should have that handled. Emma asked Myra, what if it is only one member who does not hit the 20%? Would the entire consortium need to submit a corrective action plan and still need technical assistance?
So if it is the consortium as a whole, so we're looking at the consortium as a whole and whether the consortium, irregardless of how many members or what their carryover percentages are. So this is where it'll be important for the consortium, lead or director to, at this point, because we're currently in March, and so it'll be important to start tracking and monitoring what the members have, alerting them. For those of you that opted in during this current fiscal year, 23-24 CFAD, you may have already seen some of these tools populate when you've noticed a corrective action plan. You may have seen some of these filters already alerting you. So you should be working with your members, but also members be paying attention to that carryover because you might be the one that prompts your consortium to be flagged as a whole for reaching that excessive carryover threshold. And so to Emma's question, the consortium will be required to complete irregardless of how many or who has that carryover. And so it is something that as a consortium, you want to be working together currently, not waiting until September 30th, because that's just going to be the deadline where we run our first cycle analysis of where we are at with this first year of carryover. I hope that answers your question, Emma.
Thank you. Stephanie asked, will the written plan be required after this year, 23-24, if the consortium exceeds 20% or next fiscal year, 24-25?
So it will, we are, as we've mentioned, 23-24, and I think we can also post the memo. We released a memo about a year ago in February, a memo, an FAQ, and a timeline. And those are 3 really good resources that were also mentioned in the webinar. And I think, Neil, I don't know if you recall, we only had about 60 people attend that webinar. So if you missed it, there was a lot of great information that we went through and we covered. But essentially this year, fiscal year 23-24 is year 1. We're in the middle of tracking year 1. So on September 30th, once Q4 is certified, if the consortium has excessive carryover, because legislation says on an annual basis for the consortium, then NOVA will populate the written expenditure plan. And so you will see that later this year. If you are one of those lucky few to test out this written expenditure plan, hopefully you don't fall in that. So monitor your carryover. But this is the year, and after September 30th, when we run that first snapshot, it will flag. You will also see some tools that we covered in that webinar. You'll see flags, will identify for you. There will be multiple tools and resources that will notify the members in the consortium where you all stand. There's flags. And then the written expenditure plan will also populate for you to complete for this fiscal year 23-24. So yes, you will see that populate after the September 30th because we are in the middle of tracking year 1. Now, in legislation, it talks about the member excessive carryover. So the member carryover is analyzed for 2 years. So if the member has 2 consecutive years of excessive carryover. So that's very important. If the member has 2 consecutive years of excessive carryover, then that is where that opportunity for the consortium has to vote to reallocate the member level funding, but it has to be 2 consecutive fiscal years. Whereas with the consortium, it's on an annual basis. So if at the end of this fiscal year, 23-24, the member or the consortium, because of the members' excessive carryover exceeds the 20%, they will be prompted to complete the written expenditure plan for this year after the September 30th. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you. Catherine asked, can you show again the consortium level carryover component and NOVA? I am familiar with the member level monitoring. So Mandalee, would that be something you can show? Yes, she's getting
Yes.
it ready.
Sorry, I was on mute. So Let me stop share and then I will open up Nova. Okay. And then, sorry, remind me again, we're looking at the CFAD member carryover.
Sorry, I scrolled down, the carryover, the consortium level carryover component in Nova.
Okay, and that's going to be found in your CFAD. So when you go to your consortium, you'll click on your CFAD. Sorry, I have to move my Zoom controls. All right. So we're going to go ahead and say yes. We're just going to pick one just to kind of move forward. Because I want to get you here. So the carryover, the member carryover threshold. Is this correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to, who asked the question?
Catherine
I'm just looking for exactly what she wants to walk through.
Catherine Walker. I will read it again.
Okay.
It says, can you show again the consortium level carryover component in Nova? I am familiar with the member level monitoring.
Okay, so maybe Myra, you can also help with this, but the only thresholds, carryover threshold that I know of in Nova is the member level, where you would either toggle this on or off. Otherwise, on the back end, are you talking about the dashboard?
Yeah, I think she is talking
talking
about the
about the-
dashboard that'll
Okay.
show where you stand when you certify your expenditure reports, how close you are to, you know, the 20% at the consortia level. I think it's in blue,
It's in
maybe.
the fiscal reporting tab.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of tools that were embedded, and that includes the update to the CFAD, in fiscal reporting as well. So actually, Mandalay, if you're able to click on one of the examples, I don't know if there's any, I think all of them might be complete, but maybe if you can select one of the fiscal reporting a consortium.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of areas and flags that you can already see. And I don't know if they're populating here. Maybe the current year, Mandalay. I think you're in 22, 23.
Oh, yeah. Oops. 22, 20. Oh, so it's not.
It's
So the reporting year?
Yeah. Wrong one. 23, 24.
So if you look at, there's a couple flags already embedded, and that is at the very top ribbon, you're going to see the consortium level carryover. It is flagging this for you. And then if you scroll down as well, you will see the explanation, member carryover compliance status. We incorporated a couple definitions, some helpful flags that will let you know as a member where you are at with this carryover, where your current percentage is. So one of the things that we did in that webinar that we hosted in earlier January, we did a step-by-step walkthrough of this and how it ties in. So this will be the section where you get to see the flags as a member. So it will be helpful for your members if you opt in and include a carryover percentage, because the member will be notified as they're completing their fiscal reporting throughout the year where they stand in with their carryover. And this is where you'll see the box populate, asking for a narrative if the member has the exceeded or has excessive carryover. And this will prompt the member carryover. I forgot what it's called. Let me see, I have it here. So it's the corrective action plan, the member corrective action plan. Historically, if you've been working with this program in this platform, it used to be triggered by a different setting. And so now, because of the monitoring and tracking of the excessive carryover, what will prompt the corrective action plan for the member to populate is going to be if they have excessive carryover based upon what is input in the CFAD. If you've opted in and if you've, based on those percentages that you've identified. So it can be a little tricky. We definitely recognize you're going to start to see, as you get comfortable seeing these correlations tie into one another. But this is one example. The other tool that we've embedded is located in the reports. You're going to notice a section for carryover reports. We do want to note, however, a lot of the items that are listed in this carryover compliance dashboard will not be up to date until the first full year is captured. So after September 30th, we will see the data that will be listed on here will be up to date. And we also covered this in the webinar, where there will be opportunities here to drill down on reports if you want to assess your carryover for the members, if you want to look at, it's essentially a dashboard to help monitor. And so I'm hoping this is maybe the question and the resource that was being asked. If you look at it now, the information, because we're in the middle of tracking, it's not going to be up to date until the first year is completed after September 30th. We put in earlier how critical it is going to be for the members and the consortium to complete and certify the Q4 by the September 1st, September 30th deadline. Because irregardless of that submission, our system is going to capture a snapshot of carryovers. If a member is late and the consortium has not certified the Q4 expenditure report, there may be an inaccurate capture of that carryover because Q4 has not been certified. We will handle those on a case-by-case basis. However, we want to ensure that the members and the consortium are working diligently to get their quarterly reports, especially the Q4, submitted on time. We don't want to have consortium or their members making decisions to reallocate funds because of the Q4. If it was not submitted on time, the amount might not be captured accurately. So I think it's important that, you know, consortiums, you're working with the members to ensure that these quarterly reports, especially Q4, is submitted by the deadline, so that when we run our first snapshot report, that Q4 has been submitted and we can capture the correct carryover amounts.
Thank you.
So as you were speaking, Myra, I just kind of walked through how you can just kind of keep drilling down to your consortium and then to the member for the carryover balance report. And then it'll take you here to this option.
Yeah, so we do more than likely as we get into the fall. We know we presented this in January. We wanted to make sure that during the mid-year there was an opportunity for consortium and members to be aware that this is, you know, currently being monitored. So in the fall, we could anticipate having another webinar after the September 30th once we get to drill into those reports. And so expect to have some additional training on how to access and navigate the dashboard.
Thank you. Yulene asked, what if the carryover is 20.1% to 20.999%? Is that still flagged?
I'm sorry, what was the question again, Holly?
So the question is, if the carryover is 20.1 to 20.999% carryover, is that still flagged at the state level?
I want to say yes. Our system is triggered to capture that, but I can, because we did have this question previously, and I want to say yes, but I can always go back and verify if there's going to be some of those very specific scenarios, so that way as the carryover at the consortium level is being tracked. But I want to say that is a yes, but I can go back and confirm.
Okay. And then there were some other comments in the chat that it looks like Neil is handling. Nancy did have a question. There is carryover from last year, 22-23 allocation, plus this year's 23-24 allocation. Is it 20% combined allocations or only 20% of the 23-24 allocation?
Oh, go ahead, Myra.
Oh, I'll let you, Neil, go ahead and I'll check.
Okay, I did put it in the chat. It's all active funds. So 22-23 funds were issued July 1, 2022. So 30 months after that, those funds expire December 31st, 2024. So when we calculate carryover, that would include anything remaining of the 22-23 funds. And if you don't spend it by December 31st, 2024, it has to go back to the state. So just think about that. There's probably a handful of members that still have 22-23 funds out there, but we're hoping through Q3, Q4, and Q1 of next year, you can spend that down. So it's kind of like a double hit. You'll get hit by the carryover threshold if it contributes to the 20%, and then you'll get hit again if you don't spend it by the end of the year, those old funds. So moral of the story, spend those old funds.
Yeah, it's really important, as we mentioned earlier, because of this current budget deficit, the LAO is looking at our carryover balances. So as a consortium, members, you want to ensure that you are addressing that. Presently, currently, we have measures in place with this AB 1491, also in NOVA capturing that, but you want to ensure that you are looking at your carryover. And because of FIFO, essentially, as Neil mentioned, it's an aggregate of these funds. And so I really do want to encourage you to access the PowerPoint slide deck that we presented on in earlier January. It gets very tricky because of FIFO and how NOVA is capturing these totals. And there's a lot of NOVA terminology that you will also see as you're looking at the dashboard, as you're looking in NOVA, and how the carryover amount is being calculated. In that webinar, we incorporated, in the presentation and slide deck, we incorporated some NOVA terminology. I know for me working in NOVA, it's not very user-friendly, so I'm with you all on that it's missing some context, it's missing some guidance, and so we try to incorporate as much of that as possible, but also included in the PowerPoint slide some key terminologies, references that you can refer back to as you start to look at monitor how the carryover calculations are determined.
Okay, thank you. And then there was a question in the chat, and I think Neil answered it, but I just want to make sure that we understand the question correctly. And that question was, let me just scroll and find it again. What is the timeline of carryover to be spent? So I guess the question for us is, are you asking the shelf life of funds? Or are you specifically asking a question about the 20% of carryover? I think this one and the same. Are you comfortable to come off mute? And I'm sorry, I don't know your first name. Well, Anil, we can the shelf life of funds.
Yeah, shelf life's 30 months. Carryovers 12 months at the consortia level, 24 months at the member level if you opt in, 30-month shelf life. So I guess you go 12, 24, 30. If you want to think about different shelf lives, but different aspects of spending that funding. So maybe you have a little laminated card that you stick in your back pocket that will have this breakdown so you won't forget.
Okay.
And
then
maybe TAP can create those and send those out, little laminated cards of the carryover thresholds and breakdown and shelf life and
yeah,
I don't know.
yes. Okay, so I'm just getting caught up in the chat. I know there's a lot that's been answered in there. And some tips from Susan, which are very helpful. I think there's a newer question from Tashelle. So Tashelle asks, the new carryover monitor, will it take into consideration prior year funds, or is it only looking at current year funds?
It's kind of the same question. We're looking at prior, which would be 22-23, prior year, which would be 23-24, and current year, which would be 24-25. But then those 22-23 sunset at the end of this year. If you can juggle all those balls at once, then you figured it out.
Okay, Tashelle? That was,
I just wanted to piggyback on that just to make sure I'm understanding. What I mean is that when you're on the fiscal page in Nova, they currently have the carryover bar there. And my question is that carryover bar strictly just looking at this current year's funds, or is it also taking into consideration prior year's funds into those percentages for carryover on that monitoring item there?
I think it tapped into the FIFO, but Myra, you might have a better idea on that.
It does, and I think it might be helpful, Mandalee, if you could pull it up. That way we can identify specifically, because it depends, right? If you're talking about the consortium ribbon, then yes, that is because of FIFO. It's telling you your total carryover balance that you have, which could encompass, depending if you have carryover funds from prior years, because of FIFO. But if you can tell us which, is it on the fiscal reporting tab?
Not, I'm looking right now as you're showing it for the fiscal reporting tab itself for CAEP.
Oops. Okay. I hope. No. Hold on.
Yes, it would be fiscal reporting, and it really depends on, but it will essentially aggregate the carryover balances depending on where you stand as a consortium. If your members have spent their funds, then it may only reflect what you currently have. But depending on the FIFO and what your balances you still have, based on that 30-month shelf life, then that will populate. But we'll take a look and see exactly which one you're pointing to. Is it the consortium summary tab up above?
No, continue down. That there that you just passed by.
Okay.
That ribbon right there.
So this depends. And we had a scenario that we walked through back in January, because there was a couple scenarios. This kicked in this year. So we've had a couple members reach out surrounding this already. So it depends. If the member has spent their prior year allocations, then it would only populate the current year. And this is why we incorporated these definitions. So under expenditures, it says if a negative value is present, then that indicates that current fiscal year spending has not begun, as there are still unused funds from previous fiscal years. So in this example, this member, that negative 700,000 means that they have unspent funds from prior year. So that will decrement as they spend that down. And if there is a positive, then that means current year expenditure allocation is starting to be spent down. So it depends. I hope
perfect. No, I just want to make sure that it was. I'm hoping it does, and that's why I was confirming. And so I didn't want to just show the 23-24 when there are still funds that haven't been spent. And so I wanted to confirm that I am understanding that page and that it will in fact include funds from prior years if you have funds from prior years that are unspent. Thank you.
Correct. And hopefully this those, the definitions can help clarify what you are looking at. But as we are all going through this in the first year and you're working in Nova, please reach out if you have any questions or suggestions. We incorporated these definitions, these terminologies, because of some input that we got from the field early on this year. So since you're the ones that are using it, if there's any input to help us improve how you are navigating this, we always welcome that.
thank you. And I did just get a direct question sent to me based on that slot, Mandalee, you were just in Nova. Sorry, it referenced what you just showed.
Sorry. Sorry.
But it basically what it said is if the carryover is reporting 100% when the expenditures up above equal $328,000, then it appears that the member carryover compliance portion of the expenditure reporting is not taking into consideration previous year funding. It shows that they have to expend $707,000 of their carryover prior to working down to 20% of their current allocation. Is this correct? And that might be something we might want to look into, and then we can answer, probably turn this chat into a Q&A, Myra and Neil, if you guys are comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I don't want to have you repeat the whole question. I caught towards the end. And so instead of repeating the whole question, yeah, I think an FAQ would definitely be a helpful resource that the field can have.
Okay, perfect, perfect. And then just a note from Emma. Emma says, I know you keep saying to spend, but we only have until April 30th to spend for this year. We need to keep in mind our district fiscal calendar as well. So that's just,
Holly, I saw in the chat there might be a need for some
yes,
technical assistance follow-ups. I don't know if you
yeah,
guys do PLCs or smaller learning groups or whatever, but it sounds like there's a need for some people to follow up on today and get a little better handle on. So
yes.
also the AB 897, I'm not that familiar with it, so but it sounds like there's some interest, but I don't know how we want to approach that because that is a bill related to kind of teachers and whether they get full-time or part-time, could be related to bargaining units. So we haven't dabbled in that at the state level, and I'm not even sure if it's just K-12 only, but something we can look into as well, because I know there was some conversation in the chat on that too.
Yes, and I think that Mandalay and I have discussed that we can do an open office hours. Something TAP can set up, and possibly we can get a couple of them scheduled so that people can drop in and we can walk them through. TAP is also available to assist if you email TAP and say that you need to set up a Zoom training. We're always available to jump on with you and share a screen and walk you through any difficulties you're having or any area that you need further explaining with.
And Holly, CCAE might have been involved in that AB 897, so that could be a good resource.
Okay, thank you.
And I will say, as far as TA goes, we're happy to walk through all of these different aspects, but just a reminder that there are going to be some areas that aren't going to be completely fleshed out until after that September 30th date, when all of those numbers for the carryover compliance and all of those flags are really, at that point, it'll be forward facing where we can really walk through those. In addition to the reporting, that fiscal, under the reporting, the carryover compliance, those reports too. So as those start to become more and more available, we'll be able to have another either open office hours or just have a carryover compliance webinar where we walk through those reports as they become accurate, and we can really use those tools to plan.
Yes, and Shannon did add to the chat when we were discussing that question that I received about the carryover on this screen here showing 100%. Shannon just said, since tracking is starting this year, 100% carryover means they have not spent any current year funds, which will become carryover after Q4. And so I think that was the concern, is that they have to spend any carryover prior to getting down to 20% of their current year allocation.
Yeah, one thing to add is as we have both consortium carryover needing to be monitored and member level carryover needing to be monitored, it is important to try and get your members to be aware and monitor this as they're completing the fiscal reporting, and they're going to be looking at this as well and looking at these new enhancements and trying to understand. So it'll, as a consortium, to avoid getting flagged for having the excessive carryover and being flagged to complete an expenditure plan, it's critical that members are looking at their carryover, and we recognize the constraints and timeline that it takes to spend this down. However, this legislation was passed in 22-23. We've released guidance last year, and we're trying to do our best to alert the members in the consortium from last year. And so we're in the middle of tracking, and that first year will be captured at the end of September 30th. So just something to monitor moving forward. It's going to be an ongoing, it's a policy that's already in place. And so NOVA and the tools were incorporated to help capture and help track and help the consortium and their members monitor this carryover. And we will work with the TAP to see what additional level of support will be needed, especially as we get to September 30th, and you'll start to see all those flags implemented.
Yes, thank you. We did just have a new question come into the chat. Well, first of all, a statement, I'm sorry, up above that was that on that carryover bar on the fiscal reporting, the one down below, not the consortium level, but the individual members carryover, the expenditure title is what is confusing the field. The explanation right above it is very clear, but the actual title of expenditure in the third column where it says -707, that is what they think maybe could be renamed something different, because that is what is causing some confusion to the field. So just for consideration, and I will save the chat so that we have all of that so that CAEP leadership can take that into consideration. Toybe just asked on the individual member setting, the flag toggle, is there a possibility to set the carryover level by quarters? For example, in Q1, 80%, Q2, 60%, Q3, 40%, and Q4, 20%. And so that would be in the CFAD, yes. So Mandalee will walk you through. So it looks like, Mandalee, do you want to answer this?
So Toybe, are you making a statement, or are you asking if it can be, when you say be set, are you asking for Nova to preset those for you?
Yes, please. Yes. We have to individually set it for ourselves, right? If we want to set that target.
Correct.
Okay, and you're showing it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yep.
Yes. Okay,
That's
so
very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
perfect. So as Mandalee put it in the chat, this webinar was recorded. It will be remediated, and as soon as it's available, it will be posted to our website. We will email everyone who is registered to attend to let you know when it is available. I will also download the chat, and we will work on forming a Q&A document that we can post along with the recording, because the chat had very good questions, very helpful, very good suggestions. So with that, that's all the questions I have seen come in. So I would just like to give a moment for Myra and Neil and Mandalee. Do you have any last words of wisdom for our attendees that are still with us?
Well, thank you all for being here with us today. Lots of great questions, and we anticipate, to continue to have this conversation. Providing this overview and retaining this information, I know is not going to be easy, but we're here to help. We're open to suggestions as well, and reach out to TAP. And like I mentioned, we will work to try and provide some additional training later this fall with the tools that we've embedded in Nova. So good luck, everyone, and please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
I would just say it takes a village. So thank you to everyone for participating today. These webinars wouldn't be near as good unless we had you guys putting questions in the chat and asking us questions. So that's what makes a great webinar. So thank you so much. And thank you to Myra, Mandalee, and Holly today.
Yeah. So I'll just say thank you, everyone. I know that like everyone said, this will take a village. We're all still learning together. More will become available. Along the way, we are here to support. So please feel free to reach out. You can call us or you can email us. And like Holly said, we'll remediate this and we'll post it as soon as we can, along with the chat and the PowerPoint, which has been shared throughout today's webinar. So thank you all for your time. Please take a few moments to also fill out the evaluation link that Holly has dropped into the chat. I know it was a little bit up there in the chat, but if you can grab that, it does really inform how we continue to plan this professional development. You sharing with us allows us to meet your needs where you are. So just take those few moments. We do greatly appreciate it. And with that, I think we'll let you go ahead and have your lunch back. So thank you all.
Yes, and thank you to our presenters for giving this presentation today. We appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.